Today we're going to be talking about the environmental Orientalism of Dune. As you've probably noticed, the story has many parallels to the politics and history of the Middle East. But Dune also relates to many fields of study such as anthropology, philosophy, politics, ecology, the environment, and so on. You could quite literally study Dune from any angle or field of study because of how rich and well written the story is. And there are so many YouTube videos, podcasts, and articles that do talk about Dune from various lenses. But in this video, I would like to offer a different perspective to Dune that I have yet to see either online or in academia. So today we're going to be talking about the environmental Orientalism of Dune. In part 2 of Dune, we learn more about the prophecy which Paul is supposed to carry out, and part of that prophecy would be to turn Arrakis into a green planet. And in the beginning of the movie, Stiglar says, Lisan el-Gaib will change the face of Arrakis. He will bring back the trees, he will bring back a green paradise. And right away, it reminded me of colonial myth of making the desert bloom. I don't think Frank Herbert was actually referencing this specific issue. A lot of the research that has come out regarding environmentalist colonial narratives are quite recent. However, because of how deeply connected environmental tropes are to colonial history, this narrative didn't find its way into the story, even if it was unintentional. Given the current context of the Middle East, I believe that it is worth discussing nonetheless. I think that it is very important to explore and understand how colonial narratives work, especially since they still persist to this day because of how easy they are to believe. The idea of making the desert bloom emerged in the mid-20th century. It pushes forth the narrative that prior to Jewish settlements, Palestine was nothing but an empty, barren, uninhabitable desert, a land without a people for a people without a land. With the billions of dollars that Israel has received from Jewish funds and foreign aid since 1948, Jewish settlers had the capital and technology to bring water to the desert and make the desert bloom. This sounds like a very compelling story of reviving a desert. However, it is not entirely true. Firstly, Palestine is not entirely a desert to begin with. In fact, Palestine is historically part of what is considered to be the Fertile Crescent, one of the first regions in which agriculture emerged, and it has been inhabited ever since. The land has been cultivated for thousands of years, and prior to Jewish settlement, the Arabs that were living in the land were already cultivating it to its full potential. Furthermore, Israel is not the only country to make the desert bloom. There are other countries in the region who have also carried out agricultural projects in the desert, such as Jordan, who has so many agricultural fields in Wadi Rum, yet they do not receive the same praise and coverage as Israel does. Although the amount of cultivatable land in Palestine has increased since the arrival of Jewish settlers, technical expertise in agriculture doesn't necessarily equal land ownership. It's basically the equivalent of saying that if I can use someone's iPhone better than they could use it, I could thus take it to create something of it, which is basically what's being push forth. We work the land, and so it is our land. But that's just not how ownership works. If you were to apply it to any other situation other than land, that's just not how it works. And with that in mind, why was this myth or narrative used to promote Jewish settlement and sovereignty in Palestine? The idea that cultivating the land allowed one ownership over a piece of land was first put forth by John Locke, who suggested that only the labor of cultivating the land entitles one to its ownership. He claimed that the land belonged to the industrious and the rational, aka the Europeans, and this narrative was used to justify the colonization of the Americas and the dispossession of the land from native peoples. And as the Industrial Revolution came around, European conceptualization of land and environment became more and more synonymous with industrial production, agriculture, and capitalism. environmental. While indigenous peoples lived as part of their environment, Europeans viewed nature and the environment as something to be conquered and exploited. Considering Western perceptions of land dispossession and land ownerment, it is no surprise that the Zionists use the same narrative. But John Locke's thoughts on land possession and ownership were from the 16th century. However, the idea of making the desert bloom emerged in the mid 20th century in the context of global decolonization. And this narrative still persists today in a post-colonial world. So how is it that in a post-colonial world that this narrative around land and the environment are still being perpetuated and accepted? Subjectively, in the environmental imagination of European colonizers, the environment of the Middle East and North Africa were deemed as alien, strange, and defected, in comparison to what was considered normal, which would be greenery, forests, grass, trees, leaves. And of course, Western colonial writers blamed the dry environment of the Middle East and North Africa on the backwardness of Arabs, Muslims, and Bedouins. This was, of course, a very Orientalist lens to viewing the region. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the term Orientalism, Orientalism is a term put forth by the Palestinian scholar Edward Said in his book called Orientalism, and he uses this term to describe how Europeans painted a narrative of the Orient, which is basically the Middle East, and the Far East, basically anywhere that wasn't Europe. And he explained how Europeans created this lens to justify colonialism and serve their own interests. He argues that colonialism and imperialism is not just perpetuated through military force, armies, conquest, but also through academia, art, literature, politics, and media. Colonized peoples were often stripped of their humanity and portrayed in extremes as either barbaric and uncivilized, or sensual and exotic and in need of saving from themselves, thus justifying colonialism, imperialism, and, in today's world, foreign intervention. Orientalism is usually discussed in the context of stereotypes, cultures, and peoples, and not so much in relation to nature and environments. The Orientalization of land and nature and the environment and not part of the discussion. However, they do play a very significant role in the colonization process. Orientalist environmental narratives are all around us, and they often paint the desert as this very harsh, unbearable climate in which no one can survive, despite there being peoples such as Bedouins who have lived and survived on the desert for centuries. The Zionist pioneers acknowledged how crucial it was to appeal to the West and thus utilized Orientalist and colonial narratives to carry out their nation-building process in Palestine, thus resulting in Israel appropriating the Anglo-European environmental narrative and focusing their efforts into agricultural projects to make the desert bloom. While this is all a stretch from Dune, Dune does portray to a certain extent is the internalized Orientalism that exists among the Fremen. The Fremen are waiting for Paul Atreides to turn their planet into a green paradise, despite it literally going against how they live as a people. The Fremen are often described as being part of the desert, and so it doesn't really make sense for them to believe in a prophecy or narrative that doesn't suit their interest. They still believe the narrative that was put forth by the I can't say it, but basically they believe the narrative that was put forth by their colonizers. And this internalized Orientalism does exist in the real world. There's this sort of Stockholm syndrome that exists in the Middle East, but also I'm sure in other areas in the world on the topic of colonial Stockholm syndrome. And the example I mentioned earlier on agriculture in Wadi Rum in Jordan is a good example of this sort of colonial Stockholm syndrome. It doesn't make sense to make the desert bloom in the middle of Wadi Rum when you are a country without water that is expected to run out of water by 2050, when you could just have these agricultural fields in the north where there is more rain, where the weather is a bit cooler, and it is also closer to where most of the population live. Most of the population is located in the north, and so it doesn't make sense, but it almost seems like it was done as a means to portray a certain image of the country and of the desert. I don't know, that's just some food for thought. Whether or not the prophecy in which Paul Atreides makes the desert bloom or turns Arrakis into a green paradise, this is a direct reference to Israeli colonial history or even European colonial history. I think that it is worth mentioning because it does portray a certain weakness that we have as humans in assessing environmental narratives and environmental tropes. Many films and series, including Dune, perpetuate this subconscious acceptance of the desert being an inhabitable environment, the subconscious acceptance that we have towards environmental narratives and environmental tropes is why states and companies are so efficient at greenwashing, and it is why they get away with narratives like making the desert bloom or being eco-friendly. But it is always important to take a step back and acknowledge the inherent Orientalism and Eurocentrism that exist around such environmental claims. All environments are just as beautiful and dangerous as each other. There is definitely no singular environment that is better or worse. They are all unique in their own way. And for most of existence, humans have adapted to the environment, and for the first time in history, it can now be the other way around. We now have the technology to change our environment instead of changing the environment itself. Aside from the Orientalist and Eurocentric narratives that we've been fed, I personally think that there are two explanations to why we as humans are so vulnerable to believing such narratives around the environment. The first is that humans need water to survive, and because surviving is such an integral part of our being, we often associate vegetation to water, and water means life, so we view greenery in such a positive light because we view water in such a positive light. Another reason why I think these narratives work so well is a little more psychological. Individuals and societies will always want to believe that they are right and they are good. The extent to which they will lie to themselves and to others to believe that, I think, is insane. And it's not just the case for environmental tropes. Why other concepts and ideas such as the white savior trope and the white man's burden are all perpetuated around colonialism. We want to believe that we are good people, and by justifying it through such narratives, it makes it more digestible. The white savior trope and the white man's burden have usually been the topic of discussion when it comes to discussing Dune from a colonial perspective. However, this environmental perspective isn't really brought in. I just wanted to bring in this different perspective that I didn't really see many people talking about. Anyways, that is it for today's video. I know that there is so much more to be said on the topic of Orientalism. There are so many other videos on the internet, and there are so many other podcasts which cover Dune from those perspectives. I just wanted to offer this unique perspective. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and that's it for today's video. Bye!